For the second year in a row, the world's attention is focused on the war in Ukraine, which horrifies us due to the actions of the occupiers and honors the heroism of our soldiers. Many Western politicians, thought leaders, and scholars have realized that they absolutely did not understand contemporary Russia, hoping for dialogue and the aggressor's pacification. There arose a need for a new, concise definition for the ideology and practices of the Moscow regime, which led to the largest conflict of modern times. What can this be called? Not Putinism, as the aggressive imperial policy is not just the desire of one Putin, but of millions of Russians. It is a societal demand for the so-called return of lost glory that existed even before the former Chekist, who is previously unknown, led the country. Moreover, a significant portion of Russian turbo-patriots are against Putin, seeing him as too soft and indecisive. One can notice parallels between contemporary Russia and Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, or Stalin's USSR, but such analogies are always imprecise, and words like Nazi and fascist have been so overused in political rhetoric that they have become mere insults. This is why a new term, RUSCISM, emerged, as will be explained in the next episode with Cosmolot. The term RUSCISM appeared even before the start of the Russo-Ukrainian War. It was used in 2008 when Russia invaded Georgia. However, back then, few took Moscow's threats seriously, and the term hadn't gained wide usage. In the 1990s, Chechen rebels used a similar term, RUSCISM, to describe Russia's aggressive policies. Their leader, Dzhokhar Dudayev, considered this phenomenon even more dreadful than fascism, Nazism, or other hateful ideologies. Shamil Basayev said, "Your great Russian dream is to drag everyone else into the swamp." This is RUSCISM. In 2014, when Russia occupied Crimea and started the war in eastern Ukraine, the term RUSCISM became increasingly popular, especially among Ukrainians. After the full-scale Russian invasion, the word reached the international audience. In April 2022, American historian Timothy Snyder discussed RUSCISM in the New York Times, and on May 3, 2023, the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine passed a resolution defining RUSCISM and calling on the international community to condemn it. According to this document, RUSCISM is a totalitarian ideology and practice rooted in Russian chauvinism, imperialism, communism, and Nazism. The resolution lists 11 characteristics of RUSCISM, some of which we will discuss to help you understand the principles upon which contemporary Russian hate-driven ideology is built. RUSCISM is the systematic violation of human rights and fundamental freedoms. The Russian state disregards the basic rights of people within its own territory and on occupied lands. There is no freedom of assembly. Any opposition movements or protests are quickly suppressed by police forces. In Russia, there are no democratic processes, and the outcomes of any elections are predetermined. Independent media outlets are banned, and their websites are blocked. Journalists are persecuted, and freedom of speech is almost non-existent. People are now fined or imprisoned for simply commenting on social media with the truth about the war in Ukraine. Importantly, this is happening systematically, both in Ukraine and in many other countries. Human rights violations occur, but they attract the attention of the press, activists, and result in mass protests and scandals. In Russia, such violations happen continuously, and in some cases, they are even codified as legal norms. RUSCISM is the cult of strength and militarism, with regular military parades. Propaganda of the idea of the invincibility of one's own army, nuclear weapon blackmail. This is all about modern Russia. Human rights and freedoms, economic development, and the well-being of citizens are pushed into the background by state propaganda. The main indicator of the state's development is its military might. We can live poorly, but the most important thing is that everyone is afraid of us. This is a typical line of thought for the Russian public. Historical military achievements, such as the Battle of Lake Peipus and the victory over Napoleon, become elements of a cult. The foundation of this cult is undoubtedly the Second World War, which Russians have managed to turn from the greatest tragedy into an endless source of pride. One of the most vivid expressions of Russian militarism was revealed in 2020, when the main cathedral of the armed forces of the Russian Federation was opened near Moscow. Racism is the cult of personality of the head of state. Modern Russia is an authoritarian state, where all real power is concentrated in the hands of one person. The two chambers of parliament, the judiciary, even the so-called successor, to whom Vladimir Putin transferred his power for 4 years, are all decorations without any real authority. The majority of Russians sincerely believe that this is how it should be in the country. They think that a strong hand is needed to govern strictly but justly. Like Stalin did over 2 decades, a vast team of PR professionals and propagandists constructed the image of a decisive, stern, and yet wise Putin, without whom Russia would have long disintegrated due to external enemies. He promises to put them in their place and boasts of his bare chest, flies with cranes, and demonstrates judo moves. There are even more archaic elements of the cult of personality that resemble dictatorial regimes of the 20th century, with giant statues, giant portraits, flattering words from subordinates and artists. A significant portion of the population truly believes in this. Racism is self-aggrandizement through the violent suppression or denial of the existence of other nations. The oppression of subordinate nations was part of the state policy of the Russian Empire, and some of them were even denied the right to exist. Notably, the Valiev Circular and EMS UKs prohibited the use of the Ukrainian language in theater and the printing of books in it. In the USSR, where one of the declared ideological principles was the friendship and equality of nations, Russians still claimed a special role as the elder brother who took care of all the others. In contemporary Russia, it is only on paper that it is a federation in which national minorities are guaranteed language and cultural rights. In reality, the process of Russification continues. Racism is the spread of influence on other countries through Russian language and culture, the Orthodox Church, media, and non-governmental organizations. In civilized states, this is done naturally and respectfully to other cultures and is called soft power. For example, France, the United States, or South Korea do this without any issues. In Russia, this work is conducted intrusively and aggressively, with a clearly formulated political task to keep those countries that the Kremlin still considers part of its sphere of influence under its control. The most influential Russian figures in cinema, music, literature, theater, as well as church hierarchs and leaders of propaganda media are essentially high-ranking officials. Racism is the use of prohibited methods of warfare, systematic war crimes, crimes against humanity, the creation of artificial conditions for famine, and other forms of mass physical terror, including genocide. In all of these aspects, Russia has significant experience. This can be seen in the history of genocide against the Cherkasy and other subjugated nations, the Holodomor, Stalin's deportations, and the mass killings of Chechen civilians in the 1990s. This list could extend to a separate publication. And today, the world has witnessed Bucha and similar atrocities. In many liberated cities, evidence of war crimes, such as torture, mass graves, and crimes against humanity were discovered. War crimes occur on both sides in any war, but in normal circumstances, they are investigated and the perpetrators are held accountable. For example, American soldiers who killed and tortured Iraqis in the 2000s were investigated and faced consequences. The distinct feature of racism is the systematic and unpunished nature of such crimes. Racism includes nuclear weapon threats and technological disasters. In their speeches, Russian politicians often openly or implicitly hint at the use of their nuclear arsenal. They claim that the country cannot lose in a war or special operation because they can always bomb Ukraine and its Western partners with nuclear missiles in the 21st century. This rhetoric might sound like utter madness, but if this rhetoric is not seen as a bluff, other threats appear more realistic. For instance, Russians placed their military equipment near the nuclear power plant in Enerhodar and have repeatedly implied that the station could be targeted by Ukrainian forces. Racism involves the creation and support of armed groups in other countries to secure diplomatic leverage. Russia often acts indirectly, using local collaborators, mercenaries, and ideological supporters to establish proxy forces in different regions. This approach was used in Abkhazia 30 years ago, Crimea, and eastern Ukraine in 2014. This is not a new technique for Russia, but it has become their signature approach in recent times. When confronted, they can claim that the conflict is not of their making, and that anyone with Russian passports has made their own choice. Furthermore, they can say that they have no direct military involvement in these situations, even though they maintain control behind the scenes. RUSCISM involves economic and energy blackmail. Besides military aggression, Russia uses another form of terror energy threats. The idea to cut off gas supplies and leave some countries without Russian gas was voiced in the 1990s. However, with the arrival of Putin, this threat became more serious. In 2009, Russia stopped gas supplies through Ukraine, leaving Eastern European countries without gas during the middle of winter. One major victory for the Kremlin was the construction of several new gas pipelines to Europe, including the Nord Stream pipelines. During the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Moscow hoped that its energy leverage would force European countries to cease support for Ukraine and lift sanctions against Russia. Fortunately, Europe realized that dealing with the Russians is risky and began diversifying its energy sources, reducing its dependence on Russia. In conclusion, the ideologies of hatred from the 20th century, such as Nazism and fascism, have been defeated and are no longer relevant. Communism also faded away after the disintegration of the Eastern Bloc in the USSR. However, racism has emerged as a new threat to global peace in the 21st century. Hopefully, as racism disappears, the modern empire of evil, the Russian Federation, will also cease to exist. Racism is a violation of international law and encroachments on the sovereignty and territorial integrity of other states. Ukraine was far from the first country to suffer from Russian aggression. In the early 1990s, Moscow intervened in the internal affairs of Moldova and created a gray zone within it, the Transnistrian Moldovan Republic, which was not recognized by anyone. This entity served as a lever of pressure on Moldovan authorities. The same was done in Georgia, where with the support of the Kremlin, separatist entities, South Ossetia and Abkhazia emerged. As for Crimea and further aggression against Ukraine, there's no need to say much. Up until 2014, Russia had officially recognized Ukrainian borders, including in a 1997 treaty and under the Budapest Memorandum, which guaranteed Ukraine's territorial integrity. Russia justified all these actions as a defense of peace, often referring to international precedents such as the bombing of Belgrade by NATO forces, the independence of Kosovo, and the international coalition's invasion of Iraq. However, none of these situations were similar to what happened in Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine.